All right, today we're tackling one of the biggest, most powerful ideas in all of science, Darwin's theory of evolution. It's an absolutely world-changing concept, and we're going to break down exactly how it solved one of the most beautiful and complex puzzles life has ever presented.
So what is that puzzle? It's biodiversity. I mean, how did we get from the very first super simple life forms to the absolutely staggering, mind-boggling variety of life we see all around us today? You've got everything from fungi to fish, bacteria to blue whales. For centuries, this was just a massive, profound mystery.
Well, the first clues were literally hidden in the rocks right under our feet. You know, the fossil record. It started showing us that life wasn't static. It wasn't always the way it is now. These trilobites are a perfect example. You can see different versions from different time periods. These creatures were everywhere. They dominated the planet. And then, poof, they vanished, and new things took their place. So it became super clear that life has this incredibly long and deep history of change. The big question was how? What was driving it?
Okay, so before Darwin came along, people were definitely trying to figure this out. There were other ideas floating around. And probably the most famous early theory came from a French naturalist who came up with a mechanism that, well, it feels really intuitive, but it turned out to be wrong.
And that was the idea of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. His theory, which we now call Lamarckism, was basically this. Any traits an animal or plant acquires during its lifetime, it can pass those down to its kids. The classic example is the giraffe. You know, it stretches its neck to get those high-up leaves, and because it stretched its neck, its babies are born with a slightly longer neck. It's a classic use-it-or-lose-it idea, and you can see why it was so appealing. It kind of just makes sense on the surface.
And this chart really lays out the biggest differences between the two ideas. You see, Lamarck thought there was some kind of internal vital force that was just pushing life to get more and more complex. And in his view, there wasn't really a struggle to survive. But Darwin's theory? It was going to be radically different. He put the emphasis squarely on that struggle for existence, and he argued that what gets inherited are the variations you're born with, not the things you change about yourself during your life.
And this is where science does what it does best. It puts ideas to the test. The whole idea of inheriting acquired traits, it got tested. A biologist named August Weismann did this famous and admittedly pretty grim experiment. Get this, he took mice and cut their tails off, and he did this for 20 straight generations. Now, if Lamarck was right, you'd expect that eventually the baby mice would start being born without tails. But they weren't. Every single generation was born with a perfectly normal tail. The experiment was a huge deal because it showed that changes to your body, what Weismann called soma, don't actually change the reproductive cells, the germplasm, that you pass on to the next generation.
So, okay, if Lamarck's idea wasn't the answer, the puzzle was still there. And this is where a young naturalist named Charles Darwin steps onto the stage. He's traveling the world, gathering all these clues that are eventually going to lead to an absolutely revolutionary breakthrough. Darwin was just this incredibly meticulous observer. He was fascinated by all the little differences, the variations between individuals. He actually got really into pigeon breeding, and he saw how breeders could pick and choose tiny traits to create these wild, dramatic new kinds of pigeons. He called it man selection. We call it artificial selection today. But then he saw this exact same principle at work out in the wild. You know, on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that the tortoises on each island looked different. Their shells were uniquely shaped, perfectly adapted to the specific food available on their island. But he was still missing one final, crucial piece of the puzzle. And the funny thing is, the clue didn't come from biology. It came from an essay by an economist named Thomas Malthus. Malthus was arguing that populations, people, tend to grow way faster than their food supply can keep up. And that leads to competition, to struggle, a struggle for existence. And when Darwin read that, it was like a massive light bulb just switched on over his head. He realized this wasn't just about humans. This was happening to every single living thing in nature. And that right there was his key insight. He connected that struggle for existence with all the variations he'd been observing. It was brilliant, really. If every individual is a little bit different and they're all in a constant struggle to survive, then it just makes sense that any little variation that gives one of them a slight edge, any edge at all, is more likely to be preserved, as he put it. And he gave this process a name, natural selection. It was just like the man selection he saw with pigeons, but this time it was nature itself doing the selecting. Okay, so how does this whole process actually work? Well, Darwin's big idea can be broken down into 4 really clear, logical steps. You can think of them as the 4 pillars that hold up the entire theory of evolution by natural selection. All right, let's walk through them. First up, overproduction. It's simple, really. Organisms make way more offspring than can possibly survive. Think of a maple tree and all its seeds. Number 2, variation. All those offspring are slightly different from each other, and those differences can be passed down. No two are exactly alike. Third, and this is the big one, selection. Because there's a struggle, the individuals who have traits that are best suited to their specific environment are the ones who are more likely to survive and have kids of their own. Now, we often hear this called survival of the fittest, but it's crucial to remember that fittest doesn't mean biggest or strongest. It just means the best fit for that moment and that place. A great modern example is antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In a body full of antibiotics, they are the fittest, and they're the ones that survive to reproduce. And that leads to the final pillar, number 4, adaptation. Over many, many generations, those successful traits become more and more common in the population, and the entire group becomes better adapted to its environment. See, selection is the process, adaptation is the result. That's the engine of evolution.
Now, that is a beautiful theory, right? But in science, a theory, no matter how elegant, needs evidence to back it up. For Darwin, and still for us today, some of the most direct, powerful evidence for this huge, slow process comes from the fossil record.
Because what fossils give us, which is absolutely crucial, is the dimension of time. They're like these little snapshots from life's history, letting us literally look back in time and see the changes that happened over millions and millions of years. They take an idea about the past and turn it into something we can actually see and hold.
I mean, just take a look at this ammonite. This isn't just some cool-looking rock. This is the actual preserved remains of an animal that was swimming in the oceans millions of years before the dinosaurs even showed up. It's a real, tangible piece of evidence that shows us what life was actually like in a world that is long, long gone.
And this is really the key takeaway that the fossil record shows us, over and over again. Darwin had a fantastic term for it, descent with modification. It's actually a pretty simple idea at its core, that all life is related, and that new species are just the modified descendants of species that came before them.
And those trilobites we saw at the very beginning, they are the perfect illustration of this idea in action. You've got the older species from the Ordovician period down at the bottom, and then up top, you have their descendants from about 100 million years later. It's so clear. You can totally see the family resemblance, that's the descent, but you can also see all the changes, the modification, in their shapes and their features. This is literally evolution written in stone.
You know, it's really hard to overstate the impact this idea had. It was massive. Darwin didn't just solve one little puzzle. He gave us a framework that tied together the entire study of life.
Before Darwin, the study of natural history was basically just a big collection of interesting facts that didn't really connect. His theory provided what he called the hidden bond of connection. It answered the big questions, like why does a human hand, a bat's wing, and a whale's flipper all have the same fundamental bone structure? The answer? Common ancestry. They all evolved from a common ancestor. He basically transformed a hobby into the modern science of biology, a single, unified field where all of life is connected by this incredible thread of evolution.
So, there it is, the theory of evolution by natural selection. It's truly the bedrock of all modern biology, and it explains the entire history of life with just breathtaking power and simplicity. But here's the thing to remember. Evolution didn't stop with the dinosaurs, or even with us. It's happening right now, all around us. And that leaves us with a pretty big and maybe slightly unnerving final question to think about. As we continue to change our planet so rapidly, what new selective pressures are we creating? And how are those pressures going to shape the future of life on Earth?